Kia ora koutou. Welcome to this CALT Kōrero, where we will be discussing students' perspectives on the shifting landscape of education. Thank you for joining us, both in the studio and online. We're very glad to have you all here. Over the next hour, we will be discussing several topics related to students' university experiences, with the ultimate goal of stimulating further discussions among our faculty and staff that will lead to either the enhancement of existing practices or the development of new ones. At the end of our panel discussion, we will have a brief Q&A session. So for those of you watching online, please feel free to submit your questions at any time. For those of you in the studio, you will be able to participate in that segment as well. Now on to introductions. I'm Patrick Mazzacco, a postgraduate student in the Higher Education Development Center, and I'll be facilitating this kōrero. I'm sitting next to three brilliant students who will be introducing themselves in just a moment. But before they do that, we do have a quick panel update. Imogen McAllister was unfortunately unable to join us, but we are lucky enough to have Tessa Worthington here in her place. Tessa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Kia ora everyone. My name is Tessa. I'm a third-year undergraduate student doing a Bachelor of Arts and Science, majoring in genetics and psychology. And I'm also a PASS facilitator with student learning development, so that's peer-assisted study sessions. And we run revision sessions for a wide range of papers, and I'm really passionate about adapting learning to suit a wide variety of learners and different learning styles, and I'm really excited to get into some good conversations today.
Yeah. Thank you for being here, Tessa. Next we have Annabelle Paradavan.
Hi guys, so I'm Annabelle. I'm the culture and political editor over at Critic, the student magazine, and I'm also a master's student in the Department of Media, Film and Communication. I'm really excited to be here today alongside you guys. I think past couple of years in terms of both journalism and in terms of the university experience, there's been a lot of upheaval, a lot of tumultuous changes, so it'll be interesting to see what people think.
Yeah. I'm very glad to have you here as well, Annabelle. Finally, we have Quinton Jane.
Yeah, kia ora. I'm Quinton and I'm the president of the Otago University Students Association. So I graduated in December and did a Bachelor of Arts and Science in Politics, Chemistry and Math, and then I'm doing a few more papers this year alongside all my work in OUSA, just filling up some of the gaps in my minor. And so most of my study was in the COVID years. I had 1 year prior to all of that. So I've kind of seen the way that that has shifted learning alongside all the new technologies that have come out. It's been, as Annabelle said, quite an interesting time for education, and I'm really excited to talk about it today.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us as well, Quinton. Well, let's dive right in, shall we? What better place to start than a nice, friendly conversation about the impact of COVID-19? Obviously, that was a big transition moving from classrooms to Zoom rooms. If you could all just kind of share some of your stories and insights you had from that transition, both positive and negative, when you had to go to online learning so suddenly.
Yeah. I personally found it super challenging. I love coming to uni and coming to class for the social interactions, and it's kind of a collective experience as well, where you come into class and you're all like working on the same assignment and it's really hard and you can like discuss that together. Whereas when you're online, you're just kind of sitting at home in your bedroom being like, oh, I wonder where all my friends are. And that I found really hard, and just trying to like, having to get out of bed and like, you just go to your desk rather than like actually go somewhere. Like I found that accountability, the external accountability of having to like actually come to class was really valuable for me personally. But on the other hand, some of the good things that definitely came out, I mean, COVID was a very rough time and I want to acknowledge that, but some good things that did come out was definitely the flexibility that it allowed. And I think for myself and for some of my friends and stuff that I've talked to, being able to just do it in your own time and on your own terms can be really valuable, because student lives are so complex and they have lots going on. So I think it's definitely pros and cons. And also, I think everything had to become recorded, and I think that has really continued as we've gone on in this post-pandemic. It's continued, which has been really great, because I think we should be giving more opportunities for learning rather than kind of taking them away. So having leaving that flexible option, I think, has been really valuable. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with a lot of the sentiment that Tessa was saying. I think that so COVID broke out in my third year of undergrad. So I was very lucky that I had, you know, like the first year hall experience, and going into second and third year was very like normal Otago social life. And then going into third year, the lockdown started happening. And I think I agree with the sentiment that it's difficult to recreate what you do in a lecture theatre in a desk in a bedroom on a screen. So I think, especially coming from someone who did the humanities, and the humanities are about discussion and debate and arguing and what's right and what's wrong and kind of fleshing out the really big questions that we're asking in society. And I think it's so hard to translate that debate into you sitting on your laptop in your room. I do really have to commend my lecturers. They were really great throughout the whole thing, and they handled it in such an impressive way, and they were really accommodating in terms of extensions or if you needed to like drop or add a paper. But I just think overall it was definitely really challenging to try and recreate life at Otago in a bedroom. And I also think it was quite difficult going into 2021 and then 2022, when sometimes we would have normal semesters and we would be in classes and in libraries, and then we would go into a different lockdown or we would go into a different alert level, and then there were more restrictions. And so I think the chopping and changing of it was also very, very difficult. But I do agree as well that online learning is a lot more accessible for people, especially people who like might do part-time and work full-time, or might have young families, or might need to catch up or like rewatch things or go over something. I think it's really beneficial in that sense, and it's made it more accessible to lots of different people. But I think overall it was a very challenging time, and I think it's not something you can recreate easily online.
Yeah, I think the main thing for me that comes from all of this is I have a real association with like every place has a function. So when I went from studying at the library and going to classes every day to going back home to my parents' house when we locked down, I just could not focus for days at a time. And so I had ended up, we had a separate, like a spare room, which I ended up setting up as a little office space so I could at least associate it for study. But then my sisters also decided to join me in there. So now there's 3 people all trying to Zoom at once. So it was just not good on rural internet that can't handle 3 people Zooming, and then they're trying to talk as well. It was quite an experience, but I like the flexibility. I think is really the thing. So this year, with this job, I've watched every single lecture that I had online, just so that I can do my 9 to 5 as work, and then catch up on my lectures at a convenient time, so on the weekends or the afternoons. And that has been invaluable, I think, because otherwise trying to balance this kind of work and continue to study wouldn't really work. It would be really disruptive to both those schedules. And so being able to break up that time in a way that makes it manageable is probably one of the better things to come out of this, because those lectures weren't recorded pre-COVID.
I think also, like I do science majors, and one, like in my microbiology papers, we would be trying to do labs online where in real life we would be like pipetting and like dealing with real bacteria and like agar plates, and trying to do that online was almost impossible, and it really took away from some of those like practical elements of university that I really enjoyed. So I found that particularly challenging as well.
I did chemistry, and it was the same thing. It was like we were just kind of given graphs to analyze, which is not as much fun as actually doing the work, but also all the data was perfect because you were given it. And so you never had to deal with any of the, oh, I ruined this experiment and did not get what I want, or smashed my glassware everywhere and had to start again. They're kind of like learning experiences that are not assessed, but the useful parts of those courses.
Yeah.
Yeah. I say I'm very similar to Quentin in that, you know, I have my work study space and I have my don't think about work and study space. And when they two merged, it was not easy.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. And I also think in terms of student journalism, it was very hard to create a magazine every week when there wasn't a lot going on. And you're like, oh, weekly issue, guys. Here's an article on Zoom etiquette. Like, it was very, you were really grasping at straws towards the end of it. So, yeah.
I mean, backgrounds, mute button.
Yeah.
How to set up your bed is the perfect study space.
Yeah.
Well, and with that, you all kind of lightly touched on, in terms of, especially you, Annabelle, you touched about like interaction being important. And so one of the things with online learning was that online collaboration. You know, it sounded like you very much want that in person, and it's much harder for you to have those debates via Zoom. If you could all just kind of talk about what that has been like in terms of how you interact with your peers in that online learning space.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it does go back to that idea of, I think when you study the humanities, and particularly because I did politics as well, again, it's all about debate, and like you're doing this, you're sitting in a room with other people and you're being the critic and conscience of society, and is this right, is this wrong? And I also think in COVID, when the world went through a very big transformational period of political upheaval and social upheaval, and COVID sort of upended every institution, all the structures we took for granted in everyday life, I think that was such a time where you needed to have those conversations and those discussions. And so I do think it was really difficult to recreate that organic collaboration, recreate that idea of kind of seeking truth and discussion and things like that. And I mean, yes, it can be done online because you can have like break rooms in Zoom where you get paired up with someone and you can like, you know, message them on Facebook if you're like doing an assignment together. So it is doable, but it's just so not the same as what university is built for, which is that discussion.
Yeah, I think Zoom rooms especially they were trying to recreate the same experience, but they did not have that effect in terms of like when you're sitting in a lecture theatre or in a lab or whatever, or a tutorial, you're usually sitting with people like who you're friends with, who you're comfortable with, you feel good sharing your ideas, whereas in a Zoom room, it's just like you're kind of paired with like randoms in the class, which is exciting in a way because you get to talk to some new people, but it's just kind of this awkward experience because you don't really know each other. It's not like you've kind of had this like building of like support and like friendship. You just kind of like discuss this topic and you're like, I don't know this person, like this is so awkward. So I think that was definitely challenging, but I think like Facebook Messenger is like huge for collaborating at uni and is used a lot, and it's something that I use a lot, and especially for assignments and just like groups and stuff as well. Yeah, did you guys have the same experiences?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I vividly remember like when a lecturer said, we're going into breakout rooms now, watching the participants drop off in the call because they're just like, nope, not doing it. And that was them done for that tutorial. They just weren't coming back. So it just, because everyone would turn the cameras off too, and you'd sit really awkwardly. There'd be like a 15-minute window, and everyone would just kind of sit and say 4 words, and that was about it. And you'd hear tapping on a keyboard when they looked up other things. But so the one I found hardest online was math, which I think, I mean, everyone associates people that do math as quite introverted, right? But to do well in math, you have to do it collaboratively. I simply, if I'd done my minor in math alone, I would not have passed. And so trying to do that online was really difficult because when you're working through the problems, you know, you might all be able to get different parts, but you can't make those connections yourselves. And especially doing that without being able to show you're working and like how you got to those stages, just try to verbally explain this really convoluted thing you've done was really difficult. And I think a lot of people in my classes, especially like we did a paper on analysis, which was really new to everyone. And it was just impossible to explain these really abstract concepts without being able to put it on paper and show people the way that you've got to this point.
I'd say that's actually a good transition into kind of the converse of this online collaboration. You know, with that remote online learning, there's also a lot more learning autonomy, much more self-guided, because like you said, many of your lectures are recorded. You can't have that back and forth with your instructor or with your peers so readily available, and so you're more responsible for your own learning and development. I mean, I can imagine, especially for you, needing to be more of a practical learner in the lab, that must have been particularly interesting.
Yeah, and I think my whole uni experience has been during these like quite tumultuous times. So I kind of came in from high school where everything's like super structured. You go to your classes when you go to them, when you're told to, and then coming here, and a lot of my lectures you could like just do them whenever you wanted because they were just recorded, and I was like, I'm not used to that. Like, and I found it challenging because I don't want that. I like structure. I like having a structured life, and having to go from everything being really structured to like no structure all was really hard for me. Yeah, but I did also at times enjoy the flexibility that came with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think autonomy and choice are very good to have, especially when it comes to your education and when you're doing a degree that like you've chosen to do a certain subject and do certain papers. I do think it was difficult though because personally I'm a chronic procrastinator and being online like didn't really help that because I'd be like, oh, I'll just like watch this later. I can catch up on this later. And then before you know it, you're like, oh, I have a test tomorrow and I have about 13 lectures to watch. So I think it depends on the personality. I think it's really good for people who want to make their own schedules, but I think for people like me who probably procrastinate a bit or they get busy kind of doing other things, like I might be caught up in something to do with critic or something else I'm working on, it can kind of go on the back burner. So I think structure and the idea of like going to class and you have to go to this lecture, we have to go to this office hour is really, really good because you know where you have to be and when. and you can schedule your day around it. But I think in the online context, it's sort of a double-edged sword. It's great to make your own schedule and have that autonomy and have that self-direction, but it's also kind of like you could fall off the wagon pretty quickly if you're a procrastinator like I am.
Yeah, I worked out really quickly I had to go to the Zooms when they were actually happening, because if I didn't, they would get put on the back burner really quickly. And one of my papers was like recorded and uploaded rather than on Zoom. So I had my Friday afternoon was watching the whole week's lectures in one go, because otherwise I would not do them and I'd end up falling further behind. Which I think that autonomy worked well, but it also meant that I kind of never checked out of studying either, because I would just always be, oh, I can go and do this, especially when we were locked down at home. I'd be like, okay, I'll go work on this assignment, I'll go catch up on this, and I burnt myself out a bit more than I probably would have if it had been going to class, you know, walking to uni, spending my time at uni studying, and then going back home. And so it was hard to separate like myself and my social time from study, and I think that was quite taxing.
Yeah, I could actually like agree a lot. Like the lines just become so blurred between like when is life time, when is like existing outside of uni time, and
you'd
when
feel guilty for doing fun things.
Yeah,
because you're at the same desk.
Yeah, I think one thing that helped, or this has actually been something that's been happening this year, is to keep people in check. We have like a weekly test that is worth 1%, and it just means that you actually have to do the lectures, and I think it's been valuable for, it's only worth 1%, but people are willing to put in a little bit of effort just for that 1%, and so they will best stay like up to date with the lectures, because I think coming off the back of COVID and all of the online learning, especially for people like me, you kind of have to like learn about what uni was like before all of this. Like I'm kind of not used to it being so structured in a way. And so trying to like get into those routines that are how it actually potentially more should be. Yeah.
And I think that's another good kind of segue in terms of, this has been a lot of reflection so far as what that 2-year process was like. But moving forward, you know, now that we're back, I guess normalizing is, you know, maybe a word we could start using again. Are you finding that your learning practices and your preferences have changed as a result of that more exclusive online experience? Are you finding that you miss any parts of it, or that you're finding a way to integrate those two, you know, the in-person and the virtual?
I think coming from the perspective of a postgrad, I think I definitely have gone back to the pre-COVID way of going about university for 2 reasons. I think one, just personality-wise, I wasn't one for online learning. Like I need the structure, I need the times, I need to be sitting in a classroom, like doing the work, working with others, collaborating. And I also think when you get to the postgrad level of masters and honours and things like that, especially in humanities, so much of it is based on seminars. So instead of having a lecture where you sit and someone tells you information, it's a seminar if there's only like the 5 or the 10 of you, and you're meant to sit around and ask those questions and talk about particular topics and analyse things and debate. So I think I'm a very big advocate for the traditional kind of pre-COVID way of learning, because I think it's beneficial in terms of also retaining information. It's sort of that logic of how when you teach someone something else, you're also going to retain it. So I think when you have that active discussion and there's intention and like emotion behind it, and you're not sitting on a Zoom being like, God, I wish I wasn't doing this right now, I think it's 10 times more effective, and I think you're really getting your like money and values worth out of your degree and your program.
I mean, yeah, I like the in-person, but I also started working a lot more kind of in the more recent years. I think just, you know, life gets expensive, and I liked not just living on a really tight student budget. So I started working a lot more, and the flexibility that came with kind of those adaptations we'd got from online learning was invaluable for that, because I mean, I was working in restaurants, so your shifts could be all over the show. And so some weeks I'd be able to go to a lecture at that time, but some I wouldn't. And it meant that I could keep the job because I was able to watch lectures online and catch up, which if everything had been back in person in that really structured method, I couldn't have worked there. And so that was really valuable, but at the same time, it was a lot harder. And then also clashes was the other one that came quite helpful. I knew because I'd done a few years online that if I had clashes and papers, I could catch up and I'd know how to go online and learn in that system because I'd done it before and I knew that it worked for me to a point. Whereas I would have been a lot more reluctant to have taken papers with clashes if I hadn't done that already.
Yeah, I relate to that as well, like knowing that you can actually manage a clash, and also from the university's perspective, knowing that students can manage clashes as well. I think for me, as I was saying before, it's definitely been trying to transition into like what uni was like before and really treating it as like a job. Like I go to uni at these times and I do my uni then, rather than just like having so many blurred lines, like doing however many lectures I like in the weekend, and like that was so confusing, just to try and like create balance in my life. But yeah.
Yeah, and you know, Quentin, you said something pretty interesting about life getting expensive. That's another thing. Moving away from this talk of online and virtual and learning, like let's kind of move into that topic now. The global economy and New Zealand's economy and whatever. I think every student, my parents as well, in the 70s, higher education's always been expensive. It's always good to have jobs on the side, but it seems like particularly now, I have not interacted with a single student in my time here that doesn't have at least one, maybe 2, 3, 4 jobs on the side. How are you all finding that kind of demand of wanting to get this higher education, the increasing costs of it, but then also wanting to support yourself and have a good experience while you're here? What's that been like?
Yeah. So at my peak, I had 3 jobs at once. And it was, some weeks you were like, oh, I'm bordering on full-time and trying to do full-time study. And you could see that the more work I did, my grades dropped. Like there's just that really clear relationship between the two. And so it was quite difficult, but at the same time, you'd done a few years living on that really tight student budget, and that wears pretty thin pretty quick when you can see your breath and your flat and everything's going mouldy. So you start deciding I have to do more than that. And it's difficult, and it's part of why I decided to take a break from study and go and work at OUSA this year, was just because I needed some time to earn a bit of money, do something a bit different, and then come back and study. Because I think it's just those costs go up.
Yeah, I think so I'm in my 6th year of uni now, and I have always worked. So in my first few years, I would just do like waitressing and hospitality. I think I'm very lucky in the sense of that I really love my work. So I get paid to work at Critic, and I also do a lot of other kind of contract jobs in the realm of like public relations and marketing and that sort of industry. And so I'm very lucky that I work in the industry that I studied to work in, which means, it was worth paying for the degree. And I also think that it's great because I do have work from home options, and it's things like I'll get offered a contract, and as long as I fulfill the hours, I don't have to like clock into a shift at a supermarket or a cafe or something. I can kind of work around my studies. So I think I'm definitely a minority in that sense of that I love what I do and that I'm working in my field and that it's all contract and very flexible. But I do think for those first couple of years of uni, when I would work in hospitality, and it wasn't necessarily missing out on sort of academic opportunities or my grades slipping, it was more so the idea of the social life. So I was working while I was in my residential college, and I loved my hall and I made so many friends, but there were Friday and Saturday nights where my whole floor would go out and do something and go clubbing or whatever, and I just couldn't because I had to go and like work at a bar, work at a restaurant. So I think it is sort of sad to think that you can't have the full tertiary university, great college experience without having the downside of working and missing out on aspects of that lifestyle. I think that's probably a really challenging thing.
Yeah, it really is just like work, study, social, pick 2, Yeah,
I think like for me personally, I agree with Annabelle where I work at PASS and I love it because I love interacting with young people and helping improve their experiences, and I love to teach as well. So that's been really valuable. But last year I was a dishwasher, so I didn't enjoy it anywhere near as much. And that's just that is just the nature of uni, that if you want to be able to pay rent, pay for power, pay for Wi-Fi, pay for food, and then also just like have a life where you can occasionally go out to dinner with your friends, or you can like do your hobbies. Like I personally am super active and like to go and do heaps of outdoors kind of stuff, and if I want to do that and like enjoy my life then I have to work. And well, for me it's a privilege because I love what I do. Lots of people don't have that experience, and there's definitely huge inequity issues as well in that in Dunedin community as well. Like there is plenty of students who don't have to do that, I think, but then there's lots who do as well, and that can definitely create issues within that, where lots of students are having to spend times that should be spent, in my opinion, like relaxing and just enjoying your life working, or working when they during the week when most people would be studying, and that can definitely have like downstream effects as well. Yeah.
So, I mean, Quentin, you said it's kind of, pick two out of the three important things. I'd be interested to know if you or other people that you've spoken with, and maybe Annabelle, through your time at the Critic, you've come across some people who have shared their insights on this. Have any of you or someone else come up with any sort of innovative cost-saving measures over the past year or two?
The more time that I would spend at the library, the lower my power bill was. So that's quite a helpful one. Yeah, that's really the big one, is the less time I spent at the flat, the more money I could save, until you spend so far away that you start buying more food out. It's kind of like you have to find that balance.
Like you need to live closer to the library so you can.
Yeah, exactly. So I can duck home, but I lived further away to save on rent, but it means I end up buying more food out. So again, I probably didn't balance that right.
Yeah, I think it's. I think in my first year I went flatting, it was definitely the stingy, like, if you're away for 2 days, you're like, I'm not paying for power. I wasn't there for 2 days. But I think once I got to kind of third and fourth year, me and a lot of my friends kind of got to a point where we were like, it's going to be expensive regardless. We may as well not be not that you shouldn't worry, but we may as well not kind of fret on getting a certain bill down or doing this or doing that and exhausting yourself of just getting through the day for the sake of saving a few dollars, which might be very different to other people. But I think a lot of me and my friends kind of came to the conclusion of, you may as well just turn on the heater and have a hot shower and buy the avocados and just kind of accept that you might need to work an extra hour or two throughout the week, but it's sort of better to pay a little bit more and be kind of comfortable if you can do that than to kind of get through just trying to survive, I think.
Agreed. And it just makes your, if you have a warm house, you're it's easier to study, it's easier to just feel good in your life. I think I found last year we were definitely pretty stingy, and then we all keep getting sick. We're like, maybe we should just turn the heater off, and the sun would stop happening. So yeah,
it ends up being quite good for social things because we agree to heat the lounge. So then everyone comes into the lounge and we end up talking and doing activities as a flat rather than hiding in your room under blankets. So I think that was one good thing. And the other one's half-price bus fares. I live further away to save on rent, and now that buses are cheaper.
Life hack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have any of you had to make any difficult economical or spending decisions over the past 2 years as a result of that? Of trying to, pursue your degrees and be a student here, but also enjoy life? Have you had to make tough choices?
I think that was the choice to work was the biggest one there, was because I didn't work for my first 3 years, or if I did, it was 2 hours a week. And then last year I ended up getting up to more 20 hours a week. And so that really did cut into your social time, your extra study. Assignments I used to spend 2 weeks on ended up getting 2 days. And I would notice that, I'm really pushing the deadline, or I'm not quite finishing that answer that I could have finished if I'd given this a bit longer. And so those were difficult ones. And then I ended up cutting down the work because I was burning myself out. But then you go, okay, maybe I won't heat the house as much. It really was just not enough time in the day to make everything work.
Yeah, I think this is a hard one for me to sort of speak on because I am definitely a privileged minority of students. I've been very supported by access to scholarships and family support and things like that. So I've never really had to properly sit and pick and choose between what I should pay for, what I should do. But again, I think that that's shocking that I know that I'm a minority, and that's a very small percentage of the population of university students who do have that privilege and who can do that. And I also think that because I kind of had a bit more of a safety net than some other people, I was allowed to pursue jobs and work in my field and do what I love, so it doesn't ever feel like working, which then in turn gives me access to more money. So I think it's definitely hard for me to speak on. I definitely sympathise with the stories that I hear at Critic of people, you know, not being able to pay rent sometimes, or having to borrow money off their friends, and then it's awkward because you're in debt to someone else, and then you've got like this 80 grand student loan. And I think that I've definitely been exposed to a lot of it through who I've interviewed and who I've spoken to, and I also think that it is definitely important and kind of shocking to think that I'm such a small minority in terms of my personal situation.
Yeah, I would agree with Annabelle. I've also been really privileged at university in terms of access to scholarships, and that I do can go home to my family over summer and live there and have their support. But that doesn't mean that I'm not like living week to week. Like I definitely live on my student loan and the small amount of money they make. I definitely live on that every single week. And if something was to go wrong or I needed a cash influx, I just wouldn't have that kind of money. And I think that that's most students feel that way. Yeah.
And has any of this affected your schoolwork or your academics, your study habits, or your relationships with others at on campus?
I think financial stress just makes everything harder in terms of like what Quentin was saying, like you have to work, and that just becomes the norm that you have to do to survive, basically, and that does make can make assignments and just handing things on time definitely harder.
Yeah, I think it's definitely that's sort of a tricky one to think about, because I think it also shows the disparity of, you know, you'll be in a flat of like 5 or 6 people, and half of those people might work and get financial support and be perfectly fine. The other half might be struggling, and so when it comes time to pay the power bill, half the flat's like, oh, you know, all good, like that's normal price, and the other flatmates might be more kind of strapped for cash. And so it sort of seeps into your social life in terms of who has what and who has access to money and who has access to, I guess, time to do those assignments and do well. And so I think that financial stress is never fun, and it's never a good situation to be in. And I don't think anyone should have to pick and choose between bills or doing this or doing that. And I think that it's always a shame that that can seep into your social life or your home life in terms of just being a young person, because being in your 20s is like, it's pretty rough sometimes, I'm not gonna lie. And so I think adding those sort of elements on top can just make it seem so much worse.
Yeah, it's those inequities in time and financial position that are a hard one, because, you know, some of you end up working when you would be socialising, or it's what you do as the social activity too, because if you are working, you might have more money, or if you get that financial support, your options expand a bit more for the sorts of activities you want to do versus someone who might not be in that same position. And then kind of how do you balance that? And it's just that stress, that interpersonal stuff it's probably the hardest part of it, I think.
Well, let's move away from this depressing conversation. Let's move into something a little more exciting. Let's talk about the integration of AI and learning. I don't know if you've heard, there's this new thing called ChatGPT. maybe some of you use it in ethical ways. Let's talk about chat and maybe even other AI tools that you're using, and then how that's affecting your learning.
Yeah, I found it really interesting actually, and watching different lecturers in different departments react quite differently has been interesting to watch. I think also from like a digital literacy perspective, it's been quite interesting. Like you can definitely see people who are quite up to date with tech, and then people are like, what is that? Or it gets brought up in their lecture and that's the first time they've ever heard about it. But I've had some really interesting experiences with it. One of my lecturers, we had to co-write an essay with ChatGPT, which was a really interesting exercise where we had to like pretty much create a prompt and try and get ChatGPT to write the essay for us, and then we could edit it. And so it was like a co-creation, which was really interesting. It definitely highlighted how unreliable it can be. And also one of my exams this year, one of our questions was to like critique a ChatGPT answer for a question based on all the knowledge that we'd learned during the paper, and basically show that ChatGPT doesn't know everything. But I personally use it just for explaining things, and I always like take it with a bit of grain of salt and kind of compare it to some other places. But I have found it as a valuable tool for my education. Yeah, and those, I think it is important to adapt with technology rather than just kind of ignore it and pretend it's not happening. And I think the way that my lecturers have tried to integrate it into the courses that I take have been really interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to give a bit of a different answer to that. I'm not a fan of ChatGPT or AI. I think from, I guess, a journalistic perspective, there's a lot of kind of discourse and debate about it, because if journalism and like writing articles is in the pursuit of truth and pure information, why would you use AI or technology that is sort of manufactured on its own, and it doesn't come from a place of true investigating or a true kind of journey to find out what's really going on. It's kind of you put it in a computer and then it created something and you're like, well, that's what that is now. But I also think in terms of, especially I guess in the field of communications and media, which is what I study, there was also a lot of debate and discourse about it. I think that I'm very skeptical of technology and the idea of like the tech world in general. I often find it quite concerning how quickly we let it into our lives without any really critique or debate around it. Like AI and ChatGPT became a thing and everyone's like, oh great, it's here now, we can use this. And it's like, whoa, like why are we kind of so accepting and integrating of it when we've seen how, you know, Facebook or like
any
sci-fi movie ever, or like just anything in the past like 5 or 10 years, you can find an example of how the digital has gone wrong. And it's sort of that idea of, you know, we think it's this great new invention, but with every invention comes a new set of problems, right? It's like you build an airplane, but now you need a black box in case something goes wrong. So it's sort of the same thing for AI, because we've invented this like great thing, but it's going to create a whole new set of problems. And I can see why some subjects might be more kind of willing to embrace it, but I think, again, in the humanities and media and communications, we want to be critical of these things. That's the purpose of the field. And I also find it interesting that I think the BA and humanities in general are kind of looked down upon in a way. I don't agree with that, obviously, at all. But I think that in society, it's like, oh, like you just did a BA, like that's easy. I think that narrative is very damaging. And I thought it was interesting that when AI first came into the university sector, the first thing everyone did was sort of attack the humanities essay, like, oh, you can get ChatGPT to just write your essay. So again, like that's reinforcing the narrative that like your BA is useless or the humanities are not as important. So I'm much more skeptical of the whole thing. And I could go on, but I won't.
I think just to add to that, the purpose of my lecturers using it was definitely to highlight its downfalls, basically. Like the essay exercise that we did, it was basically to be like, it can't write you a good essay, which I found interesting in the exam question as well, around it actually doesn't know all the answers and that you know a lot more about it. And I think in terms of having like, I would prefer that lecturers are at least talking about it rather than just being like, don't use it, because they can't actually control that, and they might as well try and learn with students and have conversations and discussions about it rather than just like a blanket, don't use it. Yeah.
I think that the current versions of the AI are just not good enough that you need to be too worried about it yet. So ChatGPT is terrible at math. Right? Like it is absolutely rubbish. So I had some stuff because you can tie it into everything in here. Because I was working online, because I had to work, I was trying to get it to explain some mathematical concepts for me in just like more simple English than every resource that I could find online. And the example it was working through was just like blatantly wrong. And it was so adamant that it was correct, but it said like 2 times 4 was 6. And it's like, no, that's just like doesn't work, but it was adamant that was the case. And so it was just absolutely useless at doing that, which kind of, to me, reinforced like that it's not that useful yet. And I did error check some code for me, which was helpful. I couldn't find the little typos that I'd made, and you plugged that in and it went, it's here and here. And so that was quite helpful rather than sitting there doing that for 20 minutes myself. But beyond kind of those as a tool, I don't think it's too problematic yet, because the essays are garbage, right? The articles that it will write will be garbage because it's working on kind of that what is the best, like most probable next word that it's got. So it's only going to give the most generic, boring response. And you can tell that from anything that it does create. You read it and you go, that's written by AI, because all these sentences are really regular lengths, really plain English. Like there's no pizzazz to anything that it puts out, right? It's kind of soulless work. And I think that's because it's not created by a person. And so I think in a way we're lucky that it's not at that point yet when it gets here, because we can now have these debates about, how can we use it? Is this something we should be progressing with? Because I definitely have concerns about what better AI might look like. But I think those versions of ChatGPT and all the other ones we have at the moment are not good enough that there's too much to be worried about yet.
Yeah, I think for me it is just that idea of the slippery slope. It's like we can sit here now and say ChatGPT doesn't really work and it doesn't really give the answers it should, but I think, technology moves so fast, and like I said, we're so quick to be like, this is a thing now, this is part of our everyday lives, this is part of our institution, let's just adopt it. I think it's that slippery slope of that might be fine now because it's like pretty average and it doesn't really work that well, but in 5 years from now or in 10 years from now, for all we know, we might not be able to make an autonomous decision because the machines are gonna not to sound like I'm in a sci-fi movie, but technology will become so rampant. It's just we need to make sure that we don't get too far ahead of ourselves, I think, is the thing.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm very much on the very always skeptical about it. We were talking before the show about other technologies, and I told you I stay adamantly away from anything social media related. I miss my 90s flip phone, so I'm still very skeptical as well. But it is interesting. It is here, and we are figuring out what it is, its voice, its identity, its uses, its pros and cons. And universities are going to have to start to come up with policies related to these tools. What do you all think those policies, at least what we have now, should be as far as using these tools?
I think that, as I said, I don't think that the tools are phenomenal yet. And so we can look at them as tools rather than as complete, going to take away the humanities essay. And instead you could use it as a way of proving some of your work and checking, kind of, if you can work with it, there's less to be concerned about than if we ban it blankly, because then you will have students who will use it anyway. And they might have used that, where do you draw the line kind of with that if you're going to ban it blankly of this is mild academic misconduct because they've used that tool. And so I think that you need to embrace that it's there, question the ethics of it, question how we want to integrate it, but accept it as a tool, because otherwise people were asking the same questions when calculators came out for mathematics. Should you be doing these, doing this by hand or putting it in your calculator? And you can use that to speed up how we can learn math, how you can use math, how you can teach it, what you can do in a course. And so I think that as long as we're skeptical of it, think about the right uses of it and use it as a tool, it has a place.
Yeah, I think in my degree I've done some programming with RStudio, which is a statistical software, and it's really great for just being where's the error in this? And I think that really has, and bioinformatics, which is kind of biology and statistics combined as a field, is really valuable and can really accelerate jobs like that, and also degrees involved in that, purely just because you have to do less work yourself, which sounds bad, but
it's just you run it in those compilers and it'll be the errors are on this line.
Helping. And I think it can be really valuable in that way, and so thus we shouldn't just have blanket ban on it. But I think in terms of the humanities, it is scary, and I think the whole point of a degree in general, in my opinion, is a lot about creating critical thinkers, and it can kind of take away some of that. So it's definitely something that needs to be thought about a lot in terms of policy making.
Yeah, I definitely think there is an emerging field within the humanities called digital humanities, which seeks to deal with this very topic, which is great because it proves that humanities are very useful and of the times. And also, just because it provides a place for people to sit and think, is this ethical? How do we go about it? And like Quentin was saying, for the mathematicians and the scientists, which I'm definitely not a mathematician, it's good for, you know, checking code and checking those quick facts and whatever. But I think in terms of keeping the idea of being the critic and the conscience of society and keeping the idea of debate and the ethical idea of truthful journalism and truthful writing, I think it's definitely important that we regulate it, we put the brakes on and say, we don't necessarily need to reject this and throw it in the bin and be done with it, but we need to sit and think, what are the repercussions of this? How quickly can this get away on us? And definitely ask those big questions and not be so quick to ingratiate it into our everyday lives.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a lot to think about. I do have one final question for you all before we get into our Q&A session. With everything we've talked about today, you know, these new tools, this hybrid learning of online, in person, and you know, the economic struggles facing many students today, what do you see higher education or universities looking like, the landscape of them in 10, 20 years from now? How do you see them being similar or very different?
I think we'll see a lot more online distance learning. And I think that's just because of the way, like, people are continually wanting to learn more so than they ever did. And I think that's part of, you know, nowadays when you could have got a job, you then needed a bachelor's, and now you're looking like you need a master's. As people have to keep pushing out when they can get to that qualification that'll get them into the workforce, they're also going to want to start working and whatnot. So that online learning will kind of work in tandem with people who are wanting to upskill alongside. So you'll end up doing, like, the online MBA is becoming a really big thing, getting really popular. And I think we'll see more of that, those kind of professional level degrees becoming a thing as people choose to switch careers, as these technologies emerge that might open up new fields of work, so that we can see people weaving between. And I think that that's only ever going to work digitally, because people can't afford to quit their job for 2 years and come back and study and then go back into the workforce. So I think that, and I don't think that's something to be afraid of either. I think that looking at new ways that we can make learning more accessible is always a good thing, and opening it up to people that might not have ever thought they'd come back and do masters. But I think just making sure that, like, the education remains as good and still provides people with all the skills, not just tooling them for jobs, helping them for whatever they might want to get to, but doing all the things that a degree needs to do, is probably what needs to be focused on as we move into that kind of digital learning space for people that want to come back.
Yeah, I think that in order for us to kind of move forward and make education really innovative and things like that moving into the future, I think we can't look at just universities as an institution and just be like, oh, are they going to go online or are they going to not go online? We need to kind of look at everything all at once. So it's not just university, it's housing and regulations and the cost of rent and flexibility and jobs and wages. Like, there are all these, like, interconnected ideas that all come together, and they're all such intense issues.
It's a micro community.
Yeah.
Such a politics student.
And so, you know, I do agree with Quentin that I think online learning is great in terms of accessibility, like with our MBA program, for people who want to go back and study while continuing to work, or their employers might, you know, subsidise the cost of that to get them more qualified. I think those sort of initiatives are great, but I really hope that universities do hold on to what they have been historically in those centres and those places for debate and discussion, and that the humanities are still, you know, taken seriously, and they're still an incremental part of the education system and the educational institutions. And I think that while technology has been, you know, well and good in terms of accessibility, I hope that universities do maintain what they have been historically as those places for that discussion and that debate. And I also think that it should highlight why we need, you know, like I was saying, rental controls. We need to think about how much we're paying for paying people in minimum wage positions. And so I think that when we think about the future, we don't just think about the university as an isolated institution. It's everything all at once.
Yeah, I would agree. Just like from an actual like educator perspective, I'd really like to see educators making a really conscious decisions to provide more flexible learning outcomes and being okay with that. Like as discussed, students have complex lives and lots going on, and there's a variety of different ways to kind of like tackle university. And I think trying and providing more ways to learn and more varied ways to learn would be really great. Yeah.
I think it really is about thinking about it as a business. You know, if you're a university or institution, you're selling a product, you're selling degrees and experiences, and it's perhaps thinking about maybe we need to think about selling a new product or repackaging it in some way.
Doesn't mean you get rid of the old product.
No,
just means
no,
you
not
sell
at
a
all.
new one as well.
Yeah.
And
Just keep adding on to your inventory.
Yeah.
And I think the in-person experiences at university are extremely valuable, so we should definitely keep those around. Like, don't fully switch to online.
Yes, please no.
That would be horrible.
Well, let's open it up to questions from our audience. Again, if you're watching online via Zoom, please submit those questions, and I will read them from my handy device here. And if you're in the studio, just raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone.
Kia ora. Thank you for that. My question's around engaging with recorded lectures and things like that. It seems to me a burden that you've taken on yourselves, trying to manage keeping up with that material. In your experience, what techniques and styles have instructors had that made that easier for you?
One of my lectures this year, we've kind of done like a flipped learning approach where we watch the recorded video first before going into class, and then the class is just kind of like a discussion, revision of the content, and I've really enjoyed that approach. Lots of people probably haven't enjoyed it as much, but she, on the recorded lectures, puts like little kind of like we'll ask questions about the content, or like maybe puts an MCQ in, and I found that just like nice to stay engaged with it, because you kind of like learn something and then you do like a little question about it, or it'll be like a discussion point or something, and then that'll get brought up in the class lecture, which has been cool because you're not just sitting there for like an hour just like content being thrown at you. You can like contribute back, which I found really cool. And also the 1% weekly tests that I mentioned are really good because you like have to watch them to be able to do the test, which is cool. Yeah, and it's like a good way to stay in check. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of students are going to cancel me when I say this, but I think making participation part of the grading. So I think something that really incentivizes people to go to a class, go to a tutorial, is being like, if you don't go, have fun paying to take another paper, because like you failed this one. So I think, you know, a lot of papers that I've done, it's like 10 to 15% of the grade is class participation, and not just showing up, like actually talking and raising your hand and asking a question. So I think that could be a really good way to get people involved, because I think that's a good incentive to not only have them go regularly, but it will probably make life easier in the long haul, I imagine, because the more engaged you are with content, or the more you're kind of taking the learning in, the more likely students are to, I think, enjoy the paper. And also I think the idea of collaboration and what you were talking about with the kind of weekly 1% test, and like watching the video and then going into the class, I think that's also a really good idea, because again, it is that logic of, if you learn something and then have to kind of repeat it or kind of, you know, teach it to someone else, you're probably going to retain it and actually be really into it. So I think it all comes down to the idea of incentivizing, and then, I don't want to say penalizing, but I guess penalizing if it is lacking without reason. Of course, if someone has a reason for not going, then that's a different story. But
I think it's hard because we have just spent like quite a lot of this talking about like flexible approaches to learning, and then like make it more accessible, and by enforcing class participation in a way, you are like taking away some of that autonomy, which is it's a hard one to balance, I can't lie.
I was going to say, yeah, I think if you have that participation one, it has to be with caveats, just in case someone is working and studying separately or something, because I would hate to penalise someone if it's their situation as opposed to a choice not to attend. I think that hybrid learning is the hardest one to deal with in this space, because, you know, if you go to an in-person one, you're a bit more engaged just by the nature of being sitting next to a person and kind of that conversational approach. And with an online thing, you can tailor it. So for me, it really is that interactivity. So even if it's not like sitting on a Zoom and having a conversation, because a lot of people don't like that, but a way that there's a little just questions that you might answer based upon things that you've had, something that kind of makes you think about the content as you're going, rather than just sitting there listening to what's a podcast for 45 minutes, something that kind of draws you into it a bit more. And that's where the kind of hybrid version's difficult, because you have to do that kind of something that goes in person and something that suits online. I had one lecturer who, if you went to his lectures in person, he would give you little clues about the exam before the recording went on, so that always incentivized me to go, because you could just kind of get a bit of a better feel for the content. But just, yeah, something that gives you a reason to engage and to not tune out and click on another tab is really, I think, the best way to do it.
We do have a question from our Zoom room. It's from Simon. It asks if any of you have had any experience of teaching staff adding polls to recordings.
So that's kind of what I was talking about before, where we, this lecturer will, like, sometimes it'll be like a poll, like related to the content, or it'll be like a discussion point question where it's like, what do you think about this? And then we'll go and discuss that in class, like in a few days' time, or it'll be MCQs. But I've also had like polls on Zoom. I think you can run polls on Zoom, or questions, which is cool. But I really like appreciate when there's an immediate opportunity to like just apply your knowledge and think about it in a different way, rather than it just being like memorize all of this. You can then go and apply it, and that helps retention anyway. Yeah,
I think that's sort of a tricky one for me to speak on, because when I was in third year was when we first went into COVID, and so I think the first couple of lockdowns, so much of it was like, just get through the paper, just get through the lockdown. I don't think there was really kind of time to think about like, how do I make this, you know, fun and interactive, because everyone's like, I just want to get through this lockdown. And then obviously again in postgrad, I think that because it's very small groups of people, like usually only 5 or 10 in a class, and it's, you know, in person, it's kind of all about that discussion and that debate. I think I've ever had any experiences with like an interactive or like a poll in a Zoom, because I think that it's not really a thing anymore. So I think it's difficult for me to speak on that, but I can see why it would be a good incentive to get people into Zooms to kind of do like fun little things like that.
Yeah, so the things that I'm talking about are on a recording on Echo 360, so they're like embedded in the video. Yeah, which is cool.
Yeah, I've not really had much experience with it at all, but I do think it would help. Just something that kind of gives me a reason to go and engage. I know some papers that I have had now do a thing after each lecture. It's literally one question related to the content that you've covered, and it's a separate web page, but you still go and do it, and you have 24 hours after the lecture to do it, to try and keep you on top of the lectures. And so my flatmate was doing the paper a year later, and he found that a really good way to keep on top of them, because he was a prolific procrastinator. And so the papers that had those, he was on top of the lectures the whole time, and the papers that didn't started to fall off towards the end of the year.
Well, that just about wraps up our time. We're just about at the hour mark, so we do need to give some acknowledgements. I'll begin my sign-off by first thanking the three of you for joining us today. Thank you for being here, sharing your insights, and providing such stimulating conversation. You've given us all a lot to think about, so thank you. We'd also like to thank everyone in the audience, both online via Zoom and those of you who joined us in the studio today. And of course, we'd like to acknowledge the Committee for the Advancement of Learning and Teaching for facilitating this Kōrero series, as well as the media production team for bringing it all together and putting on such an amazing show. So thank you again to everyone involved, but that is our time, and that is the end of this Kōrero. Be sure to tune in for our next episode next month. Until then, matewa.